Hello, everyone. Good morning. I'm getting the wave from the back of the room that we're supposed to start with the very first panel of these beautiful few days here. Welcome. Thank you for being here. A lot of friendly faces in the room, and thank you for joining us this morning as we dive into the history, the present, and the future of product in news. I want to briefly introduce my fantastic panel here. I'm super glad that they agreed to be on this panel here with us today. Feli Carrique, sitting next to me, Executive Director of the News Product Alliance. We have Mariah Craddick here, Executive Director of Product at The Atlantic. We have Nic Newman here, the longtime lead author of the Digital News Report and still affiliated with the Reuters Institute. My name is Anita Zielina. I'm the CEO and founder of Better Leaders Lab. I asked everyone to kind of kick it off, since this is like what we're trying to do is we're going to try to kind of do an analysis of the last 15 years of news product, what worked, what didn't, what did we learn, what are we taking into the future that also includes AI and product, obviously, and the big transformation there. So I asked everyone to very briefly introduce themselves and say a little bit about their product history. And I'll start, and then I'll pass it to Mariah here. So my history with product is that I've worked in product roles pretty much all of my media career, but way before they were called product roles. Today we'd call them product, but for the first years I did work that was connected to understanding my audience better, learning how to think about delivering content, thinking about business models and transformation, driving change management. A lot of what these days we'd call product, and actually the only proper product role I had was the last industry role that I had as Chief Product Officer. So quite of an unconventional path and journey. Mariah, what's your journey into product?
Sure. Good morning. So I think kind of fell into product and had a little bit of a maybe traditional path for product managers in news, but I started out as a journalist and very quickly discovered I wasn't built for it, but was still very interested and dedicated to journalism and wanting the industry to thrive. And so I moved into audience development and marketing roles before eventually pitching the concept of an audience engagement editor when I was at Crane Communications, which publishes a lot of different trade publications in the US. And then they eventually started a product team, so I joined that product team. Product in name only, was essentially tasked with taking requests from all around the org and filing tickets. But that at least got me the title. I was able to go on to McClatchy and run a product team there, eventually the Wall Street Journal, and now I'm at The Atlantic, where I've been leading product for the last 4 years. So that's been my journey.
Thanks, Mariah. Feli.
So my journey is actually a bit normal for product thinkers, actually. So Anita just mentioned I run the News Product Alliance, and that's a community of support and practice for 3,000 news product thinkers. We recently surveyed to understand what were their paths, and it made me feel not that special with my own journey, but it made me feel seen. So it was an eclectic journey. I started as a reporter. I taught myself enough code to understand what was possible, and I joined a nascent innovation team, which at that time was actually working on developing a chatbot. And this was 10 years ago, so imagine that there were no LLMs. It was mostly regex statements and a lot of decision tree designing. And also demand was not there. But I did not know that at the time because I did not know the type of work we were actually doing until I moved into a different stage in my career, working with media entrepreneurs, and got to understand a bit more about the complexities of business development in news. Finally, I was able to articulate all that, and thanks to a group that was the starting News Product Alliance, I could put a name of the things that I was doing. and start doing it more intentionally. And it seems like from the last survey that we did, most of the people doing news product work actually come and have some background from editorial combined with technical skills, and we are now starting to shape it strategically.
Super interesting, and we'll get back to the survey and some kind of current research and work that you all are doing in the second half of that panel. Nic is going to do a bit more of an extensive introduction because I asked him to, not because he talks more than us. So it's not his fault, it's mine. Because Nic has actually written, can you maybe show this beautiful piece of paper to the audience? Nic is actually the author of, I would still say, the very first comprehensive report on the state of product management in news. That was published 15 years ago, which is ultimately why we decided to do this panel. And have Nic, and I gave Nic the very difficult task to say, why don't you just summarize 15, 16 years of your work in news product, of your work as the lead author of the digital news report in 7 minutes? I present.
I'm going to take the baton for that. So I'm going to just talk a few minutes about my experience of living through the beginnings of product management in the news industry and some of the attempts to sort of shape common practices, and finally a few reflections on where we are today. So my background is also in journalism.
I think... switch off.
Maybe I can, yeah. So my background is also in journalism. Almost 25 years ago, I was asked to take on what was then the technology team. I said I'd do it for a month. I stayed for 10 years as head of product for BBC News. And I can tell you that at the time, developing anything was an absolute nightmare and generally ended in disaster. We used project or program management approaches. Design was by committee. Meetings were incredibly large, and the projects took years to complete if they ever did. But this was really the game changer. This was the first time we really talked about product at the BBC. It's the BBC's iPlayer, its streaming platform. After 3 years of failing to get this massive thing launched using program management techniques, we tried something different. So essentially taking a product-led approach. We're going to launch this thing on Christmas Day 2007, and the heart of it was a fundamental change in methodologies. So this is it. Traditionally on the left, you have this waterfall model. You start with the plan. You write this enormous document, has a huge list of features, and you don't launch it until every single one of those things has been developed, every feature has been developed. And then on the right, the idea behind agile methodologies is that you flip it on your head. You start with the schedule, you say we're going to launch on Christmas Day, and then what you're trying to do is develop features that are of most value to the audience. So this idea, and then you release those at the point you think you have this thing called the minimal viable product. And then you collect feedback on it, and then you build the next thing in this sort of iterative way. And this is really a sort of game changer. It was revolutionary, and obviously makes much more sense in a world where technology is moving really fast, where audience behavior is moving really fast. The old waterfall models really didn't work. So this is where the research came in. The report that Anita referred to, product management was suddenly this buzzword, but most people had no idea what it was. And so this research was really partly for me to help codify what it was and put in place a training program and trying to get some of these common practices established. And we talked to Google, we talked to YouTube, we talked to media companies to identify best practice. And you know, I've also just sort of highlighted one paragraph. So, but beyond consistency about trying to define what the role was, it was also what we found was this real struggle for control with other parts of the organization who didn't really want to give up some of the power that they had to this new role that everyone was talking about. And to a greater or lesser extent, these battles for control, I think, have persisted since. So you, in my mind, you have this three-sided triangle. So in media companies, content editors have traditionally made the calls. About editorial, but also about, you know, the design of newspapers, all that kind of stuff. But in this new world, of high-moving complexity when technology is moving fast. It's impossible for an editor to decide, what's happening with a new AI model or whatever it is. And so Power sort of shifted to technology for a while, and they said, right, you can make all the decisions. And then that didn't work because it was too unresponsive, so they put it back to editorial, or they gave it to business or marketing. And in every restructure, you lost a lot of momentum, and you lost a lot of the best people as well. And the answer, of course, is you have to work together in a different way, in cross-functional ways, and you need this role, the product manager, to kind of bring all of these things together in the interest of the audience. So we used this metaphor at the time, this idea of the conductor, which is about, obviously it's about shaping things, but it's also about listening. And it's about keeping everything in harmony, which is one of the reasons I really like that. And of course, part of the conductor's toolkit was this common set of language. This is actually the Guardian's product process 15 years ago, and it draws very heavily on a book by Marty Kagan called Inspired. You'll probably recognize some of the language around the opportunity assessments, discovery, all of these kind of things. I think what's different today is that, particularly discovery, shaping a product, is much more now about building prototypes, building things that you can test in real life, what I call minimal viable experiments, and then getting feedback on that before you commit that engineering resource. And obviously also the use of data to validate things. So we didn't have a lot of that data or a lot of those skills all those years ago. So where are we today? This is from a Reuters Institute survey we did a few years ago with 300 news leaders, business leaders, and you can see, I think we've come a very long way. I mean, 93% now think that the product role is critical. That's a big deal and a big change. Of course, it's not surprising given the importance of digital to those businesses these days. On the other hand, that 45% figure is quite worrying. Only 45% think the role is well understood. And this is borne out by a number of interviews I did last year. You still get people talking about product management as a delivery role, as IT. A lot of these phrases still happen. And a significant proportion of the people we spoke to also think the skills of product managers are not appropriate for a media company. So we still have quite a long way to go in terms of bridging that. We also, in the same survey, we asked people where the best ideas come from. Of course, they used to come from the top. And I think this is quite positive because what it shows is that there is a really high score for audiences and data driving decisions now, at least at an intellectual level. That was literally unheard of 15 years ago, and also that commitment to multidisciplinary teams. People really understand the value of working together in that way as well. Perhaps less positive on the right-hand side, learning from other industries, rather than being in our little bubble here in Perugia. And then I think respecting the role of junior staff. A lot of the best ideas don't come from the top. They don't come from the middle. They often come from junior staff who hasn't been there for a long time. So just a few final reflections. Really looking forward to the discussion. Product management, I think, is obviously much more professionalized. It appears in a higher place on the org chart, sometimes at board level, but it is still basically very poorly understood and not always respected. There are these battles for control, they continue, where content and the technology are hard to separate in editorial, but also with business actually, where objectives are often not aligned. And then I think there's new questions now about, as we move into an AI era and an era where the focus is less about, solving technology problems, it's more about solving business problems, customer acquisition, editorial innovation. How do you actually structure product teams so it's really embedded throughout the organization? So I think those are some reflections which I'm sure we'll pick up on in the panel. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Nic. That was fantastic and super helpful because it helps us frame the conversation a bit. We promised that we'd basically headline this panel by saying, let's look back with our experience in the industry and with the industry, what worked, what didn't. Let's do a brief round and let's everyone share one thing that worked and one thing where you feel like this didn't work and we still need to kind of adapt and evolve. Mariah, do you want to start?
Oh, there we go. All right. We're going to figure it out. What has worked? So I think what Nic just illustrated really beautifully and really succinctly and well is that a lot has worked. We have evolved so much. I think about the first role that I mentioned where I really was essentially executing on behalf of digital GMs across all of these newsrooms. And now when I get to actually contribute to the strategic direction of the company and help make decisions, it's definitely kind of, completely shifted in the last decade or so. I think the collaboration mentioned and that Nic just mentioned is absolutely a place where I see probably the most evolution, though there's still room to grow, and we can talk about what hasn't worked there. But I think in my own experience, I remember, how siloed the teams were, literally sitting on different floors. I remember part of the reason when I first moved into audience development and I was exposed to all of this information about who our audiences were, who we were serving, which was such a contrast from what we thought in the newsroom. And I remember going to editorial sometime and trying to bring information about, what I was learning, and there kind of being this really clear, church versus state, and that, reporters kind of would close their ears to, we don't want to hear that, we don't want to know anything about performance. Now, journalists are very savvy, and they are product thinkers, and they know how to talk about various product concepts. They understand what an insight is. They know how to use that to make decisions about how to program a homepage, or why what an MVP actually is. So a lot of these product concepts are now becoming, I think, or have become a lot more familiar, I think, to newsrooms. And we'll talk more, I think, about where the gaps still exist, because there are still gaps when it comes to that collaboration, and it is really hard to keep the momentum. But I think there are a lot of processes that we've put in place at The Atlantic that aim to keep the harmony between these groups and help facilitate that collaboration. But it's evolved. It has evolved.
Great.
Yeah.
Feli, do you?
Okay, so I think what we are all saying is kind of aligned, because what we've seen from the NPA over the past few years is an increase in the understanding that product is not just a trend, but mostly a strategic function. So we've seen an increase in official product titles, more C-suite positions that are related to product in some media organizations, and an increase in cross-team collaboration. So we do see product being somewhat more valued, and even as an enabler of business growth, and having more influence. But as a challenge, and on the other side, what we've heard from the community of news product thinkers is that even though they are getting into more rooms and being able to express a perspective, they are not the ones making the decisions. So there's still a lot of friction with editorial, who still holds the seat of power within news organizations, and some decisions are made ultimately without maybe consulting with product, consulting with tech, but not necessarily with a full understanding of what that is and what it would mean to actually have product lead strategically. The other thing that we've seen that has not worked well is that this progress is uneven. So we can talk with many folks that are doing some sort of product work, but this is not spread out across the industry. Not all news organizations are implementing product in the same way, and we do have some that have really invested on it, and some that are still in a very early stage of implementing either roles, teams, or structures that can support the type of work that incorporates audiences to the process.
I think if I had to summarize some of these things and add my perspective to it, I'd say that two areas where we haven't found the perfect solution yet, and where we still experience a lot of pain, both in newsrooms, but also as consultants, advisors, strategists working in that area, and a ton of confusion, are the areas of power and the area of structure, org chart, whatever. And I feel like these two areas, who has the power, what does power mean, who makes the decision, who has access to capital, who has access to teams, who ultimately decides this is what we'll be doing, and says yes and no, that is, I still see kind of a lot of fluctuation and a lot of conflict there. And the other area is really structure. Like, what is the ideal org chart for a product-savvy organization? What's the ideal org chart for potentially a product-led organization? Is that ideal? Nick, any thoughts?
I think obviously structures are important, but I think it's much more about people and common objectives, actually. And you know, I've had my share of disasters running product teams, and I mean huge disasters, and mainly they're when people aren't aligned at the top, when you don't have a common agreement on what it is you're trying to deliver. If you have that, then actually these issues of control often sort of disappear, and that's about, you know, people getting on, having that articulation. I remember Mark Thompson famously spent 6 months or longer with his top team, getting everyone aligned from the business side, the product side, the editorial side, about actually what the future was looking like. And if you do that, then further down the organization, the product stuff suddenly gets easier. And if you don't, what you get is at the product level, all of those tensions between commercial, editorial, and everything else splitting out, and it's impossible. It makes the whole job impossible. So yeah, structures are important. And just so you know, you asked about sort of positive examples of this. So I've had my share of disasters, but also share of, you know, just fantastic experiences in product. And those are always when there's been a hard deadline, when you know you have to deliver something on a particular date, you know, like a World Cup, or I remember launching an iPad, the first BBC application on an iPad, and we had like 3 weeks. And so there was no possibility to have committees and long conversations, and there was a kind of alignment that we were going to deliver a minimal viable product because there was no option. And so that was just a lovely experience, and you were really iterating really fast. You were really thinking about clarifying that objective at the beginning.
I actually love that you brought clarity in, because I feel that is such an important element. Let's talk a little bit about that org chart and structure one. Do we still see a lack of clarity? Does it work, that approach that I think many organizations we worked with are trying, that like shared power interdisciplinary matrix approach, or is that what gets us in trouble? What are your perspectives on that?
I have lots of thoughts here, because this is something that as you know, Anita, I'm looking into a little bit and talking to different news orgs, but also I've been at a lot of different places that have organized their product teams in different ways. So I've been at places where product and the newsroom were under one umbrella, at least in name, but then again, decision-making power really lied with editorial. I've been in places where product has been relegated to the business side, so has very little access and visibility into the newsroom, and only really seen as a function of the business. And I've seen obviously challenges with that structure. And I think the thing that, Nick, as you were speaking, one thing that it made me think about, you mentioned executive alignment at the top is really important, and I think that's one thing that I would agree with. And I think when it comes to product teams wherever they sit, because I don't know that there's an ideal org structure, to be honest. I think it's really dependent on the organization, the maturity of the team, what the goals are, what the product is, right? Because even though we are all in news, we all have different types of news products, and some of us are subscription-based, some of us are membership-based, some of us are, have really strong advertising businesses still, some of us still focus really heavily on print. And so I think org structure, especially for product teams, can vary, but they should be specific to that organization, is kind of where I'm starting to fall in my belief. I think that as long as there is access across all divisions from an executive perspective, so as long as the product team can have open conversations with all of the various departments, have moments where you can actually come together and discuss strategy. Because the other thing that I've learned is oftentimes product people come into news orgs and they really crave a clear mission and vision and goal from their CEO, and you very rarely are going to get it. You're very rarely going to get it, but a product team can operate as like the conduit for it, is what I'm learning, is that product people can come in, ask the right questions, understand enough about the business context, enough about the competitive landscape to start to form a strategic perspective. And as you do that, you can actually start to create that and put that on paper for the rest of the organization. And so I've seen that in my experience, where the product team has actually been able to come together, put on paper, here's what we think our strategy is based on what you've said, what the editorial team has said, what the CEO has said, what marketing has said, and then kind of found the gaps, right? And had the conversation and said, is this right? Is this wrong? And that's actually been really helpful in clarifying for the product team, because the product team has to operate with that information, or else you will fall into a place of only executing. And so I think that's one thing that I think a lot about, is like, I don't know that there's a perfect org structure. I can talk more about how the Atlantic is reorg, which we have done several times, and the latest round of our reorg, or restructure is what we've been calling it, has been very experimental, and it's still very early, so we're learning, but I do think as long as you have access to all the various functions, the heads of those disciplines, and being able to make decisions and put strategy in front of them and have them respond, I think as long as you have that, you will be more successful. Yeah.
So from where we are standing, we also see that there is no common org chart or common structure. And as Mariah was clearly pointing out, is because these news organizations are developing different products, and also they're serving different audiences. But what we've found that seems to create a better environment is when there is an understanding from leadership to what the value of product is in terms of the business outcomes. Mm-hmm. So it becomes more effective when there's clarity to what we are responding and what's the market position of the full organization, and not just for a specific product. So there are several configurations, product teams that respond to a product, like a product general admin, or a product team within tech with a mirroring product team within editorial that work together. Because we are all trying to figure out what the structure is for a well-balanced power distribution. And that is still a place, as you were pointing out, that's still a place we need to do work around, and we do need to take seriously the investment in experimenting with that until we land a minimum viable structure that secures outcomes.
I love minimum viable structure. Nic,
yeah,
thoughts on that?
I think we're going through different phases. So there was a phase where the product teams sat very much within editorial, and that meant that you had sort of inefficiency at the technical level, and so there was a sort of centralization. Some of that centralization, I think, if you're a big company like Schibsted or Bonnier, for example, that's what they're doing. They're centralizing all those things, so you have a common tech stack, and then on top of that, what you need is really flexible product people who are really close to the business. So it's not one product team anymore. To me, I think what you need, I think the world has changed. I think you need these sort of core, quite slow-moving, really robust underlying technical infrastructures that are built in such a way that you can embed product much more at an editorial level within marketing, doing the acquisition stuff. So it's not like you go to the product team and it comes back. That stuff is increasingly embedded in. So it's this much more sort of layered approach, I think, where it's kind of the connective tissue that just exists. But to achieve that, you have to have a common understanding of what product is, and that's the gap.
Yeah, and we're back to the alignment on top. Yeah. Really good point. We'll do a quick round here, but you can prepare questions that you might have in the audience. So we'll leave some time after this little round for questions, and we'd be happy to take them. Let's do a brief kind of look into the future. with all that we've talked about and all that you're seeing in your current organizations and research, what do you think is going to be that next big frontier as we think about product? What do we really need to prioritize? What do we need to consciously, deliberately work on? What should our focus be? Nic, do you want to?
That's a big question. I mean, just sort of building on what I was talking about before, I think that we've got sort of locked into this idea of having a product team for every area, and that's quite expensive because you don't always need to completely iterate every single feature forever with a sort of common product team. And I think quite often what you need to do is you need to set up a challenge, or some people call these missions, to solve a problem in a particular period of time, and you assemble this team to deliver around that. There's a lot of examples of that right now around AI, that we don't know what this product even is yet. So what you need to do is gather together all these people from different disciplines, and you give them a fixed time period. So you're using a lot of these same iterative technology, methodologies to say, you have 3 months, within 3 months, you work out what the best experiments are likely to be in that time to work out what the value is to this common objective. So I think that mission-based approach and deploying that much more around a range of common problems that slip between the gaps of product teams is the next stage.
Love that. Feli?
So I need to, yes, turn this on. So what I would say is, so first, the first thing we need to do is actually make sure that we get caught up and have product be that connective tissue that we've been discussing. And that is just for, that is for the industry's sake, right? We need to do that so that we can develop products that fit a market and are actually bringing in results. And that's, for me, the future of journalism in general. But as for the future of the product discipline, and with how much technology and how fast technology is advancing and how fast consumer behavior is shifting, we need to place the product discipline to be ready to embrace and put in the structures to develop with agility and intention into that landscape. We can now clearly anticipate a disruption, and we are not being completely taken by surprise for this. So as product thinkers, as product managers, our next frontier is to actually make sure that we are not only just assessing consumption today, but preparing the instructions to assess consumption continuously and progress and lay out the work to incorporate the technology that's being developed today.
Yeah, I think plus to everything Feli just said, and Nic, what you've said as well, which is actually what The Atlantic is trying out right now, are these mission-based kind of scrum teams. But I would say for future, and I guess my future hopes for our industry, one, I want more news product people to be in leadership positions and making decisions. I think that's partly why we're seeing kind of that continued kind of gap or misunderstanding about product and how beneficial it is to our industry, is because the people who sit at the very top are not quite clear all the time on what product's role is. And so I think having more product people ascend, which we see it happening, I think in the next couple of years we'll have more product people in these positions of power, and we'll start to see it more naturally happen, right? Because you kind of want to have product conversations, not just in your product team, but throughout your entire organization. You want your team in the newsroom and your marketing teams to all be thinking about, at the end of the day, what product means is what we're giving to the people we serve, right? It's the best way that we can do that, whether it's from the content perspective or from the actual, design and UX of it. It's all kind of product, and product isn't a dirty word either. Like, I think journalists kind of don't love the term product, or they don't like the terminology product-led growth, because it implies that the product team is leading. But really what product-led means, and I think the tech industry understands well, is that what is going to actually contribute to your growth, your success, your sustainability, is how well you can cater to the people that you serve. And that's what product-led means. And so I think we'll have a better understanding of that, I hope. We'll have more people in power who understand that, who can continue to usher in that understanding. And then the other thing I'll just say at the end too, and I've seen this recently, especially with this disruption happening in tech, and I think is a beneficial thing for news companies to think about, is we're going to see more and more, I think the next wave of product managers and people who come into news product are going to come from the tech industry. Like, I think they're looking at some of our news orgs and they're seeing some of the interesting work that we're doing. And so we're going to start to see talent come in who will, have been at Twitter, will have been at Facebook, will have been at these other places. And I think that's also going to bring in some interesting energy. And also, again, they understand what product-led growth means. And so that'll also kind of maybe be an interesting moment for our industry. And I think it's already happened and is happening, but it's something that I'm thinking about. And yeah, I think that's what I would see for the next.
Can I just add briefly to that? I think it's a really interesting, there's been a number of cases of people coming from outside the industry, and it's really hard because of the culture. So often it doesn't work, they don't stay. And I think part of this is also that they bring with them a sort of a language which is completely understood in tech, but is not understood in, and actually puts people's backs up because of the cultural issues. So things like, just phrases like product-led, phrases like backlog, which is a term that comes from agile methodologies. And if you ask journalists what backlog means, A, they think it's some product process rubbish, but also they think you're just being really slow. And so there's this massive problem of language, which is getting in the way of building connective tissue and trust. So I think it's, I actually think that a lot of transitional roles are also important. People coming from editorial, you have people like Kat Mulder, for example, at the Washington Post. That kind of thing can really help change that culture. I also think bringing people in from tech as disruptors is useful in certain circumstances, but it's a complicated one.
Your wonderful colleague, Lucy Kung, always says, John, the reason why it's so hard to bring in folks from other industries that speak business or speak tech is journalists feel they own the language.
Right.
So they are allergic to someone else coming in with language that doesn't kind of resonate and doesn't feel truthful and doesn't feel like real. And I think that is the change management aspect of that all. We'd love to take questions. I don't think there is a mic, so you need to speak up, Ulrike. And then second question there.
So my name is Ulrike.
See our colleague back there passing the mic. Give it a second.
Do live commentary.
Yeah. For our
I'll just start
listeners
over.
in the stream, I suppose.
Good. My name is Ulrike Langer. I'm a German-American media innovation journalist, and I'd like to take the chance, if I may, to ask two questions. First is, since the experts are all on the panel, maybe you can answer the question for me what a product actually is, because so far I haven't gotten an answer on that. When does a development become not just a line extension or another vertical? When do you actually say, now this is going to be a product? And the second question is, can you give me one specific example of a product that you're really proud of because the stars were aligned, the org chart worked, and so it became amazing, and one specific example of where it was a disaster because all of that was not in place?
Excellent questions. Who wants to take the what is a product question? Feli.
I'll take the what is a product question because we receive this question a lot at the MBA. And the way in which we understand product is anything that an organization creates for an audience, and that audience can be either internal or external, that creates an exchange of value. What do we mean by exchange of value? This is that the audience is receiving something and giving us something in return. And in the media industry, that can take many shapes. It could be a subscription, but money they put in for a subscription, their time and attention they put into our pieces so that we can monetize them via ads, membership or time that they offer to create things within organizations. So products are not something that we create and they just stay by its own, but they are something that we continuously nourish to make sure that we are continuously creating that value for the audience.
Great. Mariah, do you want to take the what is something you're really proud of, or something that totally failed question, whatever you prefer.
I'll go with the positive. First, that's what came to mind immediately, just because I was thinking about this recently. I've been saying it a lot because I think the question behind your question, like it's kind of hard to separate the journalism and then all the other things around it and like what part is a product, what isn't. And I think Feli, your definition absolutely, I think, clarifies it. But one example I think about recently that kind of illustrates at least like where my team comes in and then how we support the journalism. So I'm sure all of us maybe have heard the story about Signalgate and our editor-in-chief at The Atlantic being accidentally added to a group chat that he wasn't supposed to be on. So in moments like that, right, this is a huge story. I mean, we've seen more traffic to our platforms than we've ever probably have seen. And in that moment is really where at least my team kind of gets to shine a little bit behind the scenes, right? So one, making sure that that website is accessible, that the app is accessible, that people can read the story, you know, all of the technology that supports that, the experience of engaging with that story. So if you wanted to read it, you could read it, but you could also listen to it. That's all powered by innovations and things that our team have done around, you know, using AI to come up, you know, to narrate the audio, or the fact that we spent a long time re-platforming our subscription text so that in moments where there's a huge news moment, where there's a lot of traffic and a lot of, you know, interest, we can capitalize on that moment. So our marketing team can actually spin up new creative really quickly and change the paywall or the gate messaging, change the offers so that it's actually more relevant to the people coming for that particular moment. Making sure that once you become a subscriber that we are orienting you to all of the things that we have. So making sure you understand that the app is available, making sure you know what newsletters, you know, of interest to you might, you know, you might want to sign up for. So all of those things, kind of making sure that yes, people came for this story, they came for this moment, but how do we seize that moment? How do we make sure that people understand what's available? How do we convert them? All of that is, you know, a collaboration with the newsroom, with the marketing team, but also the product and technology team, making sure those systems exist. So it's not one product, it's a lot of things, but that's something I think about recently where I'm like, I think that this was an especially successful moment in our history because we were ready, because we had built all of these things to support that.
Yeah. So interesting. I'd love to share a total fuck up, if I might, just because I feel like, you know, let's have some joint PTSD and psychotherapy here. Why not? So as Chief Product Officer at NZZ, there was one product called the Select app. When I started the role, that was already in the works, and I should have killed it when it still was an infant, and I didn't, and I regret that. That was the idea that was a brainchild of journalists, not users. No user has ever said, I want this app, but a ton of the editorial leadership felt we should have an app that picks our best 7 to 10 stories of the day, like the journalistic masterpieces of all kinds, of all topics, of all, you know, backgrounds, of all disciplines. And then every day the reader gets those 10 best stories. And that's a separate app with a separate branding, and people are gonna love it. Turns out, people did not love it because no one ever said, oh, I want like journalists to give me like totally random stories that they are proud of and I'm gonna pay for that. That is not, there was no use case, there was no user research, there was a ton of, but we wanna do that because we think our journalism is great and we want people to pay for it in another way, which is not a great way to start a product discussion. And actually, I think in hindsight, many of us knew that we should have killed it at that point, but it was kind of already on the path. And there was a ton of executive, you know, basically buy-in, as in, no, this is gonna be really great. And I think that, you know, sometimes you have to be harder in killing something when you know this is not what the users want.
Maybe I can just come back. That's great. Maybe I can just come back.
You also want to share something?
I love hearing about disasters. I think I've told some of mine, maybe not. But I think the product question is really important. You know, what is a product? And it's really complicated. And 15 years ago, we documented the different types of products to try and help us understand it, because you need different processes for managing them. If you're talking about a platform product that is trying to, you know, there's enabling other products, that requires people who really understand the technology, but also understands how to do stakeholder management, etc. if it's on the audience-facing side, then apps and websites, then again that needs to be close to the business and really involve a lot of editorial and user research about what audiences want. So, and then you've got business-to-business products that are used by people within the business to make things more efficient. So I think having an understanding of that and the different skills of that are really important. In terms of positive things, one of my best ever product experiences was creating an art app for pulling together all the public art in the UK in a way that makes it really accessible. And the reason that was great is it took 3 months. It was a very, very small team. I was the product manager, the project manager, the initial designer, a whole range of other things. So that ability to cut those corners where you don't, you're small, you're agile, and we had a leadership team that was aligned on the objectives, or I helped them be aligned on the objectives. And it was a fantastic experience. It was very successful.
Love that, Nick. We had a question in the first row, if our colleague with the mic can pass it there. Thank you very much.
It is on. Hi, Francesca Dumas from Contribly. We're a UGC product for newsrooms. And this is one thing that's really surprised me, and actually that I'm hearing a lot from you, is everybody has a bit of a different definition for not just what is product, which was a really good question, by the way, but also everything else. Like, we've been researching, what does engagement mean? And the people in the newsroom have a completely different definition to the people who are creating product, How do you approach these definitions? Because that's the thing that I keep hearing. If we're not meaning the same thing with all of these different things, is that a product role, and how do we approach that?
So I'll say a few words, and then I'd love to hear some others. What I think, I don't think we're going to reach a point where we all agree on every definition. But one thing I learned is that it sometimes helps to start a process by asking, what do you actually mean when you say engagement? Or what do you actually mean when you say trust? So I feel like a good collaborative process, especially when it involves interdisciplinary teams, ideally does not start with, hey, I'm Anita, I want this and that, give it to me, but rather with, spending the first round trying to understand what are the incentives of the other teams at the table, and what are actually definitions that are being used by these other teams that might differ from ours. Because obviously for a marketing manager, engagement, they don't mean the same thing with engagement that a political journalist means. They don't mean the same thing that the social media team probably means, and probably the product team means something different as well. So I feel like trying to kind of get to that understanding first, building that bridge first, is probably a healthy approach to start. I don't know if you want to build on that, or add.
The only thing I'd add is I think that's kind of the fortunate part about a lot of journalists becoming product people, is because I think the thing that people maybe underestimate in thinking about a product role, because a lot of people misunderstand it as a more technical role, is that the language is so important, and communication is probably the most important part. And so I think, Anita, what you just said is absolutely right, in that, like, my biggest, directive often to my team is, like, don't assume anything, right? Like, make sure you understand, like, what somebody means when they say this word, try to put it on paper, make sure that you're not using jargon or, words that might be convoluted, or, understand who you're talking to, and kind of, change the way that you're talking about things for that audience. But yeah, I think the language is really important, but it's helpful. I will say that on the other side, it is helpful that because product has existed for so long, because we have MPA who do these surveys, Reuters who do these surveys, it is nice to have benchmarks and to have some common language around ways to track engagement, which I think, BBC and others have done a really good job of, like, making that public. So at least you're not starting from scratch if you are, kind of earlier in your journey with product and terminology around audience engagement and things like that. But yes, making sure that you're all speaking the same language is kind of the number one thing when you enter a room. So yeah.
The one thing I want to do is that even though news product has 15 years, it's still a teenager. So it's in its development stage. And one important part of the work that we are all trying to do in different parts of the industry and the ecosystem is build that common language. So that there needs to be an ecosystem level effort of creating the language and wording that we can use to talk to each other, and then making sure that we can translate it to the different stakeholders within our organizations.
Nic, final words.
Yeah, I was talking to a whole range of different media organizations and addressing this issue of what does product do, and everyone's got a different answer, basically. But to me, product is about building the right product. So it's a strategic role. It's about deciding, what you prioritize and where the value is for audiences or for the business, within the wider context of the business, obviously. And the technology is to build the product right. So it's not a technology role, but the product role is kind of overseeing that whole process of building, defining the right product to build, and then building, making sure that that is built right with the technology team. And just at a sort of high level, if we could get agreement on that basic distinction that product is not a technology role, it's basically something which is helping you bring out the most value for your news organization. I think that would go a long way. You can go a million ways further down to define what product actually does in the organization. That will be different for different organizations.
I think at least on this panel, we can agree on that and end on a note of agreeing on that definition. I want to thank you all for being part of this fantastic conversation. And I want to thank our audience for being here. Thanks, everyone.